Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, and welcome back to The Catholic Mama. I'm your host, Christine Mooney-Flynn, and thanks for joining me on this episode today, this morning, this evening, whenever you're listening. I am joined yet again by, guess who? Say hello.
Hello, everyone.
Husband Pat, as I refer to you.
Always good to be here.
Yeah. So as we're waiting for the baby to be born, because I think I'm going to be pregnant forever at this point, Pat is around a lot.
And I've got nothing else to do.
Nothing else to do but hop on a podcast with me, which is so sweet. Mm-hmm. Actually, you know what? So Pat was just looking at his phone for a second. You didn't comment on the picture I sent you of Lola.
Oh, no, I did post it on Instagram, though.
Oh, you did?
So,
okay,
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I sent my husband a picture of our St. Bernard, just spread eagle, sprawled out on the couch yesterday, just taking up all the space in the world, not a care.
Life with a St. Bernard is a wonderful thing.
Sure, wonderful. Actually, you know what? This morning she did do something helpful. Was I pregnant or just postpartum? That one time where I accused her of not being helpful?
Yeah, like your expectations of what a St. Bernard is or should do are completely unfounded. You were upset, and you in your moment, we'll call it a moment, you condemned her for not being helpful. I turned my head and looked to the right and looked to the left and tried to figure out what exactly you were expecting, and it still hasn't occurred to me.
There are dogs who do things for people.
What, like fetch slippers? Like a hunt, maybe? It's not helpful.
But besides that, there was one time where she was helpful, where a gallon jug of water had fallen on the floor, and the cap had come off, and a good 2 quarts had spilled out before I was able to pick it up, and she drank all the water.
She lapped it up.
So she was helpful then, and this morning again, one of our daughters spilled a full cup of smoothie, and Lola cleaned most of it up for me.
Wonderful dog.
So she can be helpful, even though she spends most of the time like that on the couch.
She's helpful in terms of beauty.
That's right.
That's how
beauty
she.
in the
Speaking
world.
of, that's how she evangelizes, which is going to be our. So there's a nice tie in there.
So we are going to do this podcast on. So a few days ago, I had asked on Instagram if people were cradle Catholics or converts or reverts, and as it turns out, I at first had done a quiz, which apparently that means that you have to select a right answer.
Oh.
So if you picked anything besides revert at first, it gave you
trick question. Yeah.
It shook the phone and with a red, it gave you a red mark. So then I switched it to a poll. And it split pretty evenly between the people who saw it, if they were cradles or reverts/converts. And then I asked, what either was the defining moment that kept you as a Catholic if you were a cradle, and then the top 3 things that inspired your conversion or reconversion to the faith.
Yeah.
If you were coming from the outside or had been away for a while.
And this is interesting, and I think that'll be the theme of this episode, if I may be so presumptuous, is we're really trying to figure out what brings people into the Catholic faith. And this is a topic that I'm always deeply interested in, and we should all be, because we are all called to evangelize. I think some people forget that it is a divine commandment after all. So it's not a fair weather option for Catholics. We have this decree by God to go out and baptize all nations, to spread the gospel. So what does that mean? It means we should be prudent. That cardinal virtue, and use practical wisdom to try to figure out what is going to be the best way to reach people in general, or this or that person specifically. So just starting with a little bit of research might be helpful into answering that question.
Yeah.
To see what has historically brought or kept people in the church.
Yeah, and I got a lot of great responses. So thank you to anybody who took the time to write that stuff out. Yeah, and I got a lot of great responses, so thank you to anybody who took the time to write that stuff out. And so we just want to, jam a little bit on that.
Yeah, we'll just kind of read through some of these because they are very interesting. And
Pat has a phone and I don't, so Pat, I think maybe you can look at it a little bit better than I can.
So I guess the first ones are from the converts and the reverts. Let's just go through these, and then we can discuss and share some thoughts and see maybe if we can come up with a few ideas of how we could put together some type of, I don't want to say battle strategy.
Evangelization plan.
Which
actually, in my, if you subscribe to the Catholic Mama, you can subscribe on iTunes or wherever else, but if you go to thecatholicmama.com or go to my profile on Instagram, you can get the free ebook that I put together about how to talk to your kids about God. And if you had done that already, last silent ways to evangelize.
That's good.
Without saying a word, which I know evangelizing in words such as something like this or asking your neighbor to come to Mass with you might be a little daunting at first. But there are many ways to evangelize, and we can talk a little about that too.
What's the saying of Francis? Preach the gospel using words, and when necessary, use memes. Is that it?
That sounds like him.
Something like that. All right. So, from the by the way, there is research. Like there's decent research that's done that really does ask, like, specifically why people leave the church. So maybe we should talk about that at the end. But let's start with what people have put in here. So we won't read the names for the sake of anonymity. We'll just read some of the responses. So one here says that what caused them to revert or convert is they felt at home at their first Mass experience, confession, and Holy Communion. So that one is really interesting because it's just the direct experience of the Catholic Church. Its person is a revert. Hence, if they went to confession, and that's a common experience I know of reverts, is they something calls them to a confession, and they have such a profound experience that the confession itself restores and renews their faith. So just that clue there makes me think this person is a revert more than a convert, since you wouldn't start with confession as a convert. But that really, I think, goes to show. And, I guess the thing I would say is, felt home at my first Mass. I go back and forth with this, of whether, we just had a discussion with this in the men's group, of whether bringing somebody to Mass is a good evangelization strategy, whether somebody should start at Mass versus somewhere else. And there was much disagreement in my group about this topic, but I know you want to say something.
Well, what I'm curious what your thoughts are. I have.
Well, my good friend, we'll call him G, and it rhymes with airy. He made the point that Mass is really is sort of the vertical trajectory of the faith. Once you're in the faith, Mass is what deepens you, what nourishes you. And his hesitation was that just bringing people into Mass, there's a lot of opportunities to not understand it, to miss the point, to misinterpret it, especially depending where they're coming from. Because the truth is if somebody is coming from, say, a Protestant or evangelical background, they might come to Mass and have a lot of their stereotypes confirmed through misunderstanding. So let me just give one example. We sometimes sing hymns to Mary, right? She's the Blessed Mother. We should sing hymns to Mary. But in a lot of Protestant circles, singing they equate singing with worship. But Catholics don't. Catholics worship, traditionally, historically speaking, when you worship God, is a form of sacrifice. Like that is the high or the saints, and they could think, oh my gosh, these people really are idolaters. But that's not the case, because we haven't made the important distinctions and understanding. Like, we never offer the Eucharist to Mary. That would be idolatry. That would be wrong, because that truly is worship and praise directed and reserved solely for God. So that was Gary's hesitation. And then you wanted to offer some comments, and then maybe we could consider some counterpoints.
Yeah, I think even though I was not Catholic my entire life up until a couple of years ago, I would have identified as a cultural Catholic because my family was either fallen away Catholics or still practicing. I would occasionally go to a Mormon service or a Baptist service or something with friends growing up. But the most frequent one was my best friend. Her family is Catholic, and so I would go with her. And then if I was visiting my grandparents, I might be dragged along to Mass with somebody up there in New York. But the most frequent one was my best friend. Her family is Catholic, and so I would go with her. And then if I was visiting my grandparents, I might be dragged along to Mass with somebody up there in New York when we would go there. So I would always feel, out of any Christian church experience that I would have, I would feel the most home in a Catholic church, even though when I looked at it, I thought it was all pomp and circumstance and nonsense. Yeah. I was like, if there is a God and this is all true, at least there's reverence here more so. I saw more reverence there than in other places. Rather than bringing somebody to Mass as a form of evangelization, I would think if you have a beautiful church in your area, as more of like a sightseeing, look at this beautiful thing that we have here.
Yes.
And I think leading with the beauty of the tradition and the building itself and the artwork might go more to showing we have this because it's all directed towards.
It makes that point. He's big on evangelizing through beauty, and certainly I've seen this work many, many times. And he used to say how many people would just visit, say, Notre Dame, and that would start a conversion experience for them. Not mass, just doing, just the touristy parts of it.
So I was at, I think we talked about this. Pat, you and I were trying to figure out the most beautiful churches we'd been to. Excuse me. And the one I was remembering was well before I converted. I went to Ireland in 2008, and I wound up accidentally stumbling in on Mass at the cathedral in Galway. And I was mortified because I was not dressed for Mass. And I knew there was a protocol. See, I knew some stuff, but I was like in jeans and a bulky sweatshirt. And I wound up participating as best as possible because I didn't want to sneak out either. But the building was beautiful, and that intrigued me. The Mass itself moment for me. Sure. I did want to be there.
And I think it can be for people. So I would add, if you're going to bring somebody, so we're not saying don't bring somebody to Mass, but
that's the first time
use prudence. Again, I think of our friend Aaron, who now is in the RCIA. He is now converting to become Catholic. We took him to Mass, but I took the time to make the distinctions between Catholics and Protestants. I had the conversations with him. And I think I helped him to understand what the Mass was before he came. And then when he did go to Mass, he was deeply intrigued. So it did help him. But I think kind of
not
laying...
as a first step.
Yeah, but laying that necessary groundwork beforehand. And now he has to go to Mass all the time. Like, he loves it, even though he isn't receiving the sacraments yet. He just loves to go. And then the other thing, too, is... You hate that it does depend on this, but it's true, right? If you have a priest that gives really good homilies, that can make a difference. Versus, especially if somebody's coming from a Protestant background, they have a very charismatic pastor, and then they see this sort of dry, dull, uninspired priest. That might be
your audience.
So very cool. Okay, the second one actually says reverence during Mass, which is to your point, and I think that is certainly true. And that definitely for me, too, as I reverted, and I know we both talk about this a lot, and we did a full episode on why we need to bring reverence back, is, God is a being. He's not a being, but when we say that he's a being worthy of worship, is that God is deserving of our right praise. He's the reason for why anything exists apart from himself. He is morally supreme and perfect. He is a being worthy of worship. And giving reverence to God is good for us. And I'm with you, even before I was religious, there was just something that just seemed very distasteful about, and this happens in Catholic Church, but it's much more common in Protestantism, of people just underdressing. It's like, really? And just like firing T-shirts off into a crowd in worship services. I like that. It's off into a crowd in worship services. I like that. That something just doesn't seem right about that. I didn't buy into any of it, but if it was true, I was going to say it doesn't seem like this behavior seems appropriate for it. And that's what I love about really traditional parishes in the Latin Mass is you go into especially a Latin Mass. Down here we have St. Stanislaus, and especially when it comes to the Eucharistic prayer, the liturgy of the Eucharist, I mean, the amount of reverence, there's no way, even if you had no idea what else was going on, there's no way that at that point during the Mass you wouldn't be able to tell that something special was happening. There's something going on here that is significant, that is special, and it's reflected in the postures, the prayers, everything about the Mass is so reverent that there's something going on here that I'm apparently supposed to pay attention to, for example. And we have this crisis in the Church now where, that's what the Mass is. All the Mass, all the Christian life is directed at the Eucharist. That's the source and the summit of the Christian faith. So if people don't understand what is really going on at the Mass, we're failing them at a fundamental level, and I think a lack of reverence is definitely there. And I know for both of us, what got me on the emotional level was the reverence that I saw for the Eucharist from Father O'Rule. Mm-hmm. And he was an incredible Indian priest, and when he confected the Eucharistic prayer, it's like time itself slowed down when he did it.
Yeah.
The amount of reverence, patience, wonder, awe, you just knew something very, very special was happening there and in and through that man every time. And I mean, I could just sit and watch him repeat the Eucharistic prayers over and over. It was so beautiful.
He was great. If you went to confession with him too, he was just so reverent in all of it. Mm-hmm. He was a very special priest. Actually, so when I think we had just watched we were watching Bishop Barron's Catholicism series, and I think we had just watched the episode where he explained the transubstantiation. So before that, I had no idea that that's what the Mass was about. It just seemed like they would ring a bell at some point, which kind of made me giggle before I knew any of this stuff. And so we just watched that episode, and then the following morning, I think that was the first time I went to Mass with you. Mm-hmm. Or it was very, very closely related to when we watched that episode. And so I just watched the episode on what, the real presence was, what's happening during the liturgy of the Eucharist. And then we go to daily Mass, and it happens to be Our Wonderful Father, Our Rule. And it was awe-inspiring. Mm-hmm. And I finally clicked, I got it. And I mentioned this actually when I had written, I did a letter for the Catholic woman, and in that, and it's true, that if I hadn't already been on my knees at that point, just so powerful, now that I understood what was happening, and then coupled with the reverence of the priest that was offering this, it was just incredible.
So in terms of evangelization, just as a practical thing, okay, regardless of how reverent your parish may be in general, you can always be reverent at Mass, in your posture, in your praise, everything. So, we can always, we might want to change many things of how, all right, I don't want to even get into it. Because we won't stop, and we have a lot of responses here. It always starts with ourselves, right? Okay. Okay, so the second point here, and this is interesting because a lot of these responses it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. And isn't that the truth, that conversion is a process? It's an ongoing process. As Catholics, we believe that conversion happens every single day. So it is interesting to see that it isn't just usually one thing for people. The second point here is the historical truth of the Church. And isn't that the truth? Conversion is a process. It's an ongoing process. As Catholics, we believe that conversion happens every single day. So it is interesting to see that it isn't just usually one thing for people. The second point here is the historical truth of the Church. And isn't that the truth, right? Is that Christ founded the Catholic Church. He gave his authority to the apostles. He gave us a pope. We have the Vicar of Christ. He founded a single, unified, visible, hierarchical, and sacramental church. And the consistent thing that you will see in terms of conversions, and I noticed this too when I was studying the different denominations of Christianity, is there was a severe asymmetry in terms of conversions. Certainly Catholics deconverted and became Protestants, but what intrigued me was the quality of conversions. And almost always the people who went from Catholicism to Protestantism, I would later see, they never even understood the Catholic faith. It was kind of I would argue, a very crude event. John Henry Newman, G.K. Chesterton. These are people who really want to understand both the philosophy, the theology, and the history of the Church. And that's what John Henry Newman's famous line is to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. When you trace the history of Christianity back, you realize, no, Christ didn't leave us with a book. He left us with a church. That church was hierarchical, visible, sacramental, unified. It just was the Catholic Church. And that always surprised me is, numbers go back and forth of who becomes Catholic versus Protestant, but there's an asymmetry, a very clear asymmetry in when I was studying this towards the Catholic Church with the quality of conversions, and that certainly struck me. Yeah,
so if you are evangelizing to others, and of course it depends on who you're talking to, if it's a friend that's Protestant and says that he wants to get deeper into his faith and is really interested in the Church Fathers, well, that's a great route to go.
Yeah, Jimmy Akin's got good books on that. The Four Witnesses by Rod Bennett is great because it's just the writing.
Route to go.
Yeah, Jimmy Akin's got good books on that. The Four Witnesses by Rod Bennett is great because it's just the writings of the Church Fathers in their own words, and you see their undying devotion to the Eucharist, deferring to the authority of the Church. I mean, it's all right there from the very beginning. And it's powerful, and it has moved historically a ton of people to the truth of the Catholic Church. Now, that's interesting because this is a more an intellectual thing. And arguments are important. And what I've found is that arguments aren't as effective as I would hope they are. And Carrie Gress brought this up in our interview, and she's absolutely right. Is we largely live in a post-logical age. People don't value reason as much as they should. So this is why it's important to have strategies such as evangelizing through beauty and goodness and other means. Arguments, I found, are good for people who are already religiously seeking. They're really trying to find answers, and they're not deeply ingrained or biased in a particular direction or point of view. Keeping people in the faith. If somebody's having doubts or they're struggling, then arguments for why Catholicism is true can really help deepen their faith and keep them where they are. But arguments are typically not as effective for moving somebody from A to B if they're already pretty solidly in position A. I found that they already need to be in a state of transition for arguments to really take hold. Otherwise, if people, confirmation bias works in all directions, but if people aren't already seeking change or at least susceptible to change, they'll find a way to either ignore the arguments or evade the conclusion in some capacity. So arguments are great. We want to know the reasons for why Catholicism is true, but unfortunately we can't expect that just giving arguments and reasons for the truth of Catholicism is going to lead inevitably to the faith.
Yeah, so that's why, we have beauty, truth, and goodness. And the Catholic Church embodies those three things, and we can lead with any number of those things or a combination.
Mm-hmm. And the last point this person makes is all the prayers. And how true is that, right? Ultimately, even with arguments, I often think, I took a really, philosophical, intellectual journey to the Catholic faith. But looking back, it was the Holy Spirit guiding me in. And I know people had been praying for me. I know my grandparents prayed for me a ton. They were my Saint Monica. So always pray.
Yeah. And it's funny. When I was at that mom's retreat earlier this week at Schoenstatt, I had mentioned to the sister who was running the morning that I had converted, and she was very interested in the whole story. And she asked, since we've converted, did I find out who were the prayer warriors behind my conversion? And I said, I was like, I assume it was my husband's grandparents. But then I was also kind of chuckling that it was a friend of ours who's evangelical, and her prayers before we even started to look for the truth was that we would find the truth. And we wound up Catholic. Probably not the way she was expecting, but my goodness, prayers don't always get answered the way we
want them to, right? Okay, let's move on. Next one, there's another 3 points here. Sola Scriptura isn't biblical was the first point. Protestants' anti-Mary attitude and the Eucharist. So, how about that first one? There's another intellectual reason. For people who aren't familiar, Sola Scriptura is one of the famous Protestant doctrines that the Bible is the sole and only authority. And there's different interpretations of Sola Scriptura throughout Protestantism. They all, some are certainly more strict or loose. This was big for me. I would argue that Sola Scriptura is either self-refuting or it's uninteresting. To the extent that you really try to push that as a doctrine, that doctrine itself is not biblical, so it doesn't even meet its own standard. No book, furthermore, can interpret itself. No Sola Scriptura is a complete non-starter. And then to the extent that, but here's the funny thing: is virtually no Protestants take Sola Scriptura seriously. How many Protestants just take a Bible and go just completely by themselves and exegete the entire thing? And how ridiculous of a task that would be. No, they take traditions from their pastor, and their pastor went to seminary,
or study Bible,
or Bible studies, or things like that. So then we're not even Sola Scriptura anymore. So that's what I mean. It's either self-refuting or uninteresting.
There's tradition, no matter what.
And then once you layer on the history of that and realize that for the vast majority of Christianity, people were, one, illiterate. There was no printing press, and Christ gave us a church, not a Bible. There's no reason to really take that seriously. Protestant anti-Mary attitude, that's an interesting one. So I would imagine this person is maybe a revert. They maybe came up in Catholicism and had maybe something of a tender devotion to the Blessed Mother, and then saw how Protestants really denigrate her attitude. That's an interesting one. So I would imagine this person is maybe a revert. They maybe came up in Catholicism and had maybe something of a tender devotion to the Blessed Mother, and then saw how Protestants really denigrate her, and that was maybe something of a turnoff, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that is true. In the Lutheran church that we were going to, I remember it was very appalling to me. I wasn't Catholic at the time, but the pastor entertained the idea. Now, look, I want to be fair. This is a fringe position, even in Lutheranism and Protestantism. But the fact that it was even brought up was just very off-putting that, did God rape Mary? And,
when was that?
You weren't at this. This was one of the studies before you came. And,
boy.
at the point, I wasn't Catholic, but I'm like, look, whatever we're supposed to believe as Christians, maybe I'm not entirely sure on everything, but I'm positive that isn't one of them, right? And, most of the people in the group absolutely disagreed with that. I mean, forget the point that it was Mary's assent that it started the whole process anyway.
Is this the one that...
The whole process anyway.
Is this the one that asked if God was a woman, possibly?
Yeah, same thing. There's a weird strain of toxic feminism going through all this. And like I said, I want to be fair. This is not, from what I understand, common in Lutheranism at all. But it did come up. And even before I had a full understanding of Marian dogma and doctrine and a devotion to the Blessed Mother, I found that extremely off-putting for many reasons. So that's something I can also relate to.
Interesting.
And then the Eucharist.
This
is a consistent theme that we've seen, that there is a deep pull and devotion to that. And how interesting that is, and you see that very consistently, is even once Protestants start to hear that, wow, maybe Catholics really actually have Jesus, there seems to be an inevitable tug that constantly goes on. So.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, the thought that how sad it is for people who are, Jesus as a human left Earth about 2,000 years ago. Man, you're missing him. If you don't have him in the Eucharist, we have him every day if we are able to get to Mass.
Yep.
For anybody who isn't Catholic and doesn't have that, it's very similar to the way Jews are still waiting for their Messiah.
Yep.
And they haven't been, if that's the case, they haven't been spoken to by God for a long, long time.
High and dry, my friends.
Yeah, a couple thousand, several thousand years at this point. And the same if you're not Catholic, but are a Christian, you've been missing out on Jesus this whole time. And it's got to feel very lonesome in a way.
He promised he would not leave us orphans. And he didn't. He gave us the church, Holy Mother Church, and he gives us himself.
And he's there every single day.
Yep. Okay, next one is more with the sacraments. Amazing to see the pull, craving confession. That's beautiful. I love to hear that. And this is something, again, my friend Aaron has brought up, that he was always intrigued by confession, that he felt. And there's many psychiatrists that actually prescribe confession, especially for people with guilt, just confessing aloud. I was wrong. It certainly was for me. I mean, I would argue that was one of the most healing experiences of my life, that confession I went to after we came into the church. Craving for the Eucharist, consistent theme. And then he says, or she says, Protestant teaching on John 6 versus Genesis 1. So that's interesting. John 6 is the famous bread of life discourse. That's the grounding for the Eucharist. And yeah, obviously, Christ means what he says there, because he doubles down. This is my flesh indeed. This is,
and he lets people walk away.
He lets people walk away. They leave him. So I absolutely agree that affirms the real presence. And in Genesis 1, I think that the thing there is maybe they're talking about how Protestants often interpret Genesis in a very crude fundamentalist sense, as literal six-day creation, young earth creationism, and how this is not a historical interpretation. In fact, we're having a study group right now with not a historical interpretation. In fact, we're having a study group right now with St. Augustine and Confessions, and Augustine was very helpful for me in this when I was trying to understand biblical interpretation. I saw through the Catholic history, 1,500 years before Darwin and everything else we know about the modern scientific age, people like Augustine were not interpreting Genesis 1 in a literal temporal sense. Augustine argues that it's actually a hierarchical ordering of reality. That God is, so just to give you an idea, and you know this, right? Because there's light before there's the sun and things like that. So it's you don't even need modern cosmology to say, okay, I don't think this is meant to be taken in a literal sense. There's a deeper truth here. And Augustine looks at it as a sort of hierarchical setting out of reality. And he's got an interesting interpretation in terms of the light and the darkness of being the creation of the angels. In the sense of where are the angels in creation? Well, Augustine would argue it's right there. It separates the light from the darkness. So that, again, and as a Catholic, you aren't obligated to adopt Augustine's view, but it is interesting to see how very early church fathers read this and saw this. as being, I would argue, much more theologically nuanced, much more spiritually rich, and it doesn't commit us to the idea that the Bible was supposed to be a book on cosmology, which is clearly ridiculous, and I think has done tremendous damage. I mean, fundamentalists have done tremendous damage culturally to religion because they have created this false idea that religion and science are at odds. And it's a total bogey. And I would agree that in their sense, they are at odds because they're thinking that the Bible is supposed to be a science book, which is patently absurd. That's not the intent of the book of Genesis. And when you look through the Catholic tradition, you realize, no, you're not committed to that. There's certainly deep, true, and real important truths that we're supposed to get from Genesis, such as God's aseity, God is above all, God is the reason why anything else. Real important truths that we're supposed to get from Genesis, such as God's aseity, God is above all, God is the reason why anything else exists, the dignity and the transcendent worth of the human person. These are deep, important truths that are in Genesis, but we're not committed to thinking that literally day one, day two, day three. Yeah,
there's a Catholic moms group that I'm part of on Facebook, and a while back somebody posted and said, were they homeschoolers? Maybe that's it. Maybe it was a homeschool group. And the woman's like, I don't know which to teach my kids. Is it evolution or young earth creationism?
Oh my God, help us! And this is where Protestantism
has
infiltrated Christianity. Because that's not...
Or
Catholicism, excuse me, yeah, because it's not an either or. Catholics can fully accept evolutionary theory. Now, I would say that there's reasons to not just do that blindly. There's certainly if God guided the evolutionary process, that helps to make sense of it. But there's strong philosophical and scientific challenges to certain parts of the theory. Yeah, so if you want to dive into some of the weeds, I've had a number of molecular biologists and population geneticists on my show just to kind of go into it. Very smart people who are specialized in the area and are themselves Catholic, right? Showing that there's no conflict. So I have interviews with Dr. Gerard Verschuren, Dr. Michael Behe, Dr. Stacy Trasenkos, all on my podcast. Just Google those names and Pat Flynn and they'll pop up if you want to dive deeper into that.
Okay, good.
So anyways, let's keep on track here. Deep longing for the sacraments again came up. Awesome. Great to see that.
If you're a revert, confession is always open to you, and start there. And I love Mother Angelica said, if it's been a long time since you've been to confession, go and then get yourself a little ice cream sundae afterwards. Treat yourself, celebrate, because it really is. And I used to have, I would lose my temper, be impatient, and I would beat myself up about it after the fact and think, how am I supposed to change after the fact? And think, how am I supposed to change? I'd be like, okay, I'm not going to just fly off the handle next time. And then next time would come and I would get angry really quickly. And, again, be very frustrated and beat myself up and think, well, there must be something morally or just fundamentally flawed about me, which is true because original sin. But I had nowhere to go besides that. I could see the flaw but not see a solution. And through confession, I've made profound progress, I think. I'm not as angry a person as I used to be.
God gives you the grace.
Right. I'm not a She-Hulk.
Yeah. No comment.
But it's really because I was able to say what the issue was, a specific issue, not just, I'm impatient. I could say, you know what, in the past 2 weeks or whatever since I went to confession, I did this and this and this, very specific. And then to hear those words of absolution. I mean, even I went to confession twice in the past week and a half because we did this very specific. And then to hear those words of absolution. I mean, even I went to confession twice in the past week and a half because we did it with the women's or the mom's retreat I was at this week. And so I didn't have a lot. I mean, I just confessed 5 days earlier, so there wasn't a lot to talk about. But even just I'm pregnant, there's hormones, and I've said things that I probably shouldn't. But just to feel, I just as soon as those words show up, I just
people need to remember that this is a gift that God gave us. He wants to give us the grace. He wants us to hear those words, your sins are forgiven. He wants to give us that assurance because he loves us. And when you see confession as a gift, rather than some weird punishment or however, people have all kinds of caricatures. And this is where I notice, again, people who convert to the faith tend to have a much higher and more beautiful, and I would argue correct view of confession than many of the kind of baby boomer cradle Catholics it's not their fault. It's poor catechesis, poor examples. I mean, there is somebody
to go to
failed
confession
them.
or else.
Somebody
Yes.
failed
Yep,
them, definitely.
exactly.
And
A bad first confession when they
yeah.
were 7 or whatever.
And part of what I'm trying to do is show them that this is such a beautiful and wonderful, incredible gift that we want to see it that way and take advantage of it. So, cool. Let's keep going. The next one, and then after this we'll switch over because we're already a half hour here to the Cradle Catholics. But this one here says having kids, feeling pulled back to the church, and the Rosary. So.
You certainly
I
having
know kids was big.
Yeah, absolutely big for me because besides the fact that for once, and I've spoken about this before, the love that I had for my child when I first became a mother was so great, and it conflicted so much with the nothingness that I thought was out there. That it seemed like, how could they be compatible anyway? How could I love somebody so much and then we'll just be, back to dust and ashes in 100 years from now? But also, and Pat, we talked about years from now. But also, and Pat, we talked about this when I think when we started to look or possibly entertain the idea of going to a church, is with all the craziness in the world, how are we supposed to teach our children the right way of things? How could we do that alone? Because, up to a certain point, parents are listened to. I mean, their children look to them for guidance. But at some point, friends swoop in and culture swoops in. And how do you protect and guide your kids through that? And if you have the Catholic Church and all the traditions and the teachings that go with that, but also the community that comes with a good church, you're not alone. And there is hope there, and you don't feel like you're adrift trying to do this all by yourself.
Yeah. Children are a blessing and a great opportunity.
And also, I have heard from many people, whether reverts or converts, that the Rosary did it for them. Either people, because one, it brought them to the church through Mary, which is
common, especially for men. And I've mentioned this before, but there's a lot of men who come in the church who, actually, it's interesting. You don't want to get too much into psychoanalyzing people and religious beliefs because it can muddy the conversation. But people who are atheists, especially many of the famous atheists, what various psychologists have realized is that they often had a very difficult or even abusive relationship with their father, and they tend to reject any idea of father figures, including God, right? But what often brings a lot of these people back to the church or into the church for the first time who had strained fatherly relationships is the Blessed Mother, is Mary. So Mary is actually a great way in for a number of men to the church. And I know men, specifically this has happened to, that it was Mary and the loving motherly pull, if you will, that helped reconcile some of those issues of authority figures, father figures, because of past abuses and things like that. And she is a great way for a lot of men specifically.
Yeah, Fulton Sheen talks about that in The World's First Love. But then also you can have, say, a Protestant coming in and say, well, that's just, it's idolatrous, or it's just rote prayer, repetitive. It doesn't mean anything if you just say the same thing over and over again, and that can be offensive. So it really just depends on
and
who you're talking to and trying to
say
evangelize.
That is like, okay, I tell you I love you lots of times per day. You say the same to me. Does it not mean anything because we repeat it, right? And I'm pretty sure Protestants, they say they love Jesus a lot.
Amen. They say all the time. Yeah.
So it's like it's kind of a dumb thing to say, And the rote prayer, specifically for me, as somebody who has what we call monkey brain, thinking in all directions at all times, it really helps. Traditionally, have those types of repetitive prayers because it centers you, it grounds you. It also gives you the ability with the Rosary to meditate on certain mysteries and to deepen your relationship and faith. So again, often comes down to deep misunderstandings that I've actually explained that to a number of people, including Protestant friends, and once they do, they go, "Oh, that actually makes sense." So as
we've said before, Catholicism makes a lot of sense. You might not just be able to say that it's Catholic as soon as you start talking about it.
Yeah. How about that? Okay, so going to Cradle Catholics now. The first one here is reading Story of a Soul, and how interesting, just reading the lives of the saints seems to really help people in many different ways. So St. Therese there.
And that's another beautiful thing, which if you are not Catholic, you don't have, certainly it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or not, you can read up on the saints. But we have 2,000 years of many holy men and women who are humans just like us and leading the charge to holiness. We got a lot of great literature that we can dive deeper into a relationship with God.
And such richness in so many different ways. Obviously, St. Thomas Aquinas was the pivotal player for me, and just his rich philosophical tradition was so intellectually appealing and satisfying to me. So in a very large way, specifically that saint played a powerful role in my conversion as well. So very cool. Next one is a powerful confession experience at Seek my freshman year in college.
Yeah, I've heard great things about Seek and other of the larger Catholic conferences that really help, especially in college. I mean, that's such an easy time to drift away from the faith. I had Katie Bogner on the podcast quite a while back, and she is a cradle Catholic and a blogger and a teacher as well. So she has actually her website, looktohimandberadiant.com, has a lot of great resources if you want to, as a parent, or if you are a teacher of religious studies or something, to bring all this stuff to life a little bit more for your students and your kids. She has a lot of fun resources on her website. But she had said that she had a moment of reconversion in college. So it's whether you're a cradle or a revert or a convert or whatever, college is a pivotal point where you're finally away from the nest. And you've got exposure to a very secular world in most cases, maybe for the first time, and having anything like a Newman Center or a Sikh conference or something like that can be very powerful in making sure that you are reconfirmed in your faith.
And it just goes to show what a channel of grace confession really is. What a gift, yet again. Next one. When I was 13, my Christian boyfriend questioned my Catholicism. Confession really is. What a gift, yet again. Next one. When I was 13, my Christian boyfriend questioned my Catholicism. All right, so sent this young man or woman down the apologetic rabbit hole.
Yeah, and we have a couple of responses here that talk about they started dating their husbands or they got married and they wound up having to dive deeper into the Catholic faith. That could be because they had to do like a pre-Cana, I'm not sure if it's still called that, the premarital classes to learn about the sacrament of matrimony, or if they just had a future spouse or a boyfriend who either they were they were Protestant and they wanted to bring them into the faith, or not religious at all. A friend of mine, to the reverse, because she's not a cradle Catholic, her husband is. She was adamantly anti-Catholic, and he was very just confidently Catholic. He didn't have apologetics too much, but he's like, I'm Catholic and that's it. Like, that's not changing. Yep. And she tried her best to change him anyway. But she said that she went to Mass with him and was awed by the reverence. Mm-hmm. And then when she went to take him to her church, she was embarrassed because compared to the reverence of the Catholic Mass and all this, her pushing of trying to tell him that Catholicism was false, and coming to her more evangelical, less reverent church service, she was appalled to look through it through those eyes.
I'd be embarrassed too.
Yeah, and she's actually a very conservative Catholic now.
How about that?
Yeah, traditional Catholic.
Sacraments and adoration before confirmation led to healing from sexual abuse and a new conviction. Well, it's always incredible to hear how healing the sacraments can be for people who've gone through any type of trauma in their life. And it is a consistent story that you hear as well.
Even, Emily Stimson Chapman, Catholic writer, she was, if you read her book, The Catholic Table, eating disorder, to actually have food be nourishing to body and soul changed her perspective. And of course, it wasn't like an overnight fix, but over time, it helped to heal her from that disorder. Yeah,
God, praise be to God. When I recognize that this is a consistent theme in my men's group as well, when I recognize that only God has power over my life, not me. So it seems like a humble submission experience there.
Yeah.
And so I have this Wednesday morning men's group, and it's great. I mean, we have such deep, intimate exchange, and this comes up as, we share our challenges and our suffering, and continually we realize that, if we don't humble ourselves, God will humble us one way or another. And once you come to recognize that God is in charge here, He's got the final say, that submission to God and reliance on God is for our own good, right? God wants what is best for us. And beyond that, He alone knows what is best for us. He's omniscient. He alone knows what is best for us. He's omniscient. He created for us. So whatever we think might be good for us, I mean, please, what do we know? We know, like really, right? But God does know, and he loves us, and he wills this. So it actually is irrational to not want to submit to God. Yeah. It's frustrating. It is actively frustrating what is for your best interest and your eternal fulfillment to not want to follow God's will and submit to his plan. Because once we know that God loves us, wills what is good for us, and knows what is best for us, then why on earth would we ever want to do anything aside from submit to God and follow his will for us?
And in our postmodern Western thinking, submission to authority is a very challenging subject. I know it certainly was for me. Submitting to anything, especially a masculine figure, was very, very difficult for me. But as Jesus promised, the yoke is light and the burden is easy. Unless I got that backwards. The yoke is easy, the burden is light? No, backwards. Either one. He's right.
How about we do one more here? Lots of great responses, everyone.
There really were some cool. Very good ones.
So just for the sake of time, we'll do one more here. A pilgrimage is another one there, and how interesting that is. But let's do this one. Meeting my husband and both researching the faith together to answer questions. So that's interesting. This is a cradle, so and that does happen, right? For every cradle Catholic, whether it's sort of a kind of a gradual process or a very specific event, there is always this authentication that they go through in their faith.
It's besides the actual sacrament of confirmation. Yes. You do have to reconfirm, especially because confirmation can happen at a time before you even get to the secular college world, or not quote unquote real life with kids and work and more responsibilities. You do have to, and I think you said this at the beginning. You do have to reconfirm and reconvert to your faith. It's an ongoing process.
Every day, every single day. Yeah, conversion is a process. Have been saved, are being saved, will be saved, is what Catholics believe, right? We stay, we have free will, we choose to accept, hopefully graciously, the grace that God is giving us. We believe that as long as we stay in right relationship to him and open to his grace, that he will make us into the people that he wants us to be and bring us to eternal friendship with him. So that's what good works is. It's a cooperation with God's grace and his gift. And so very cool. This is, and I guess, I said we would talk a little bit about the research. And when you look at the number one reason why people are leaving the church, young people, it is because they think that there is some type of conflict. And scandals are a reason too, but I want to come back to that. It's because they think there's some type of conflict between not the case at all, even close, with the Catholic tradition. What St. Thomas Aquinas taught is absolutely right. Faith and reason come from the same source. They can never ultimately be at odds. If there's a conflict, it can only be superficial. Either you're not understanding the deposit of faith correctly, like, for example, you're interpreting Genesis 1 wrong, or you're not seeing the full picture, or you're reasoning poorly. You're not getting some facts about the world right. And when we understand that, one can shine light on the other. There's a deep harmony between faith and reason. So for this, apologetics is important. Arguments are important because you can bust that boogeyman up. And if you do that, like I said before, arguments can help people stay in their faith. So you do want to understand what are some great arguments for God? What are some great arguments for the historicity of the resurrection? What are some great arguments for the truth that Christ founded the Catholic Church? Those are the three pillars that you need to understand in an apologetic sense. So have that equipment, even if you just have, what are some great arguments for the historicity of the resurrection? What are some great arguments for the truth that Christ founded the Catholic Church? Those are the three pillars that you need to understand in an apologetic sense. So have that equipment, even if you just have 5 or 6 reasons for each of those points. That's not, you could do that. You could memorize that. That might save somebody's faith. And then there's the scandals, but the scandals, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, they seem to be, obviously they're bad, right? No Catholic should be happy about the scandals or the corruption that has gone on in the church. But the people who leave because of scandals, think about it, right? It's kind of an excuse for them. They didn't really believe to begin with. If you fully believe and have good reasons to believe that God exists incarnated and gave us a church that he wants all of us to be a part of so we can win eternal friendship with him, if that's what you believe, then you're not going to leave that church, regardless of what people inside that church may do. I mean, why would you ever do that? So when people leave because of scandals, I can understand it on an emotional level. There's many reasons to be repulsed by what's gone on, but it tells me on a deeper level, they're missing some important truth of the church, right? And the greatest saints have always, and look, the church has never been free of corruption. It goes right back to Judas. Always have reformed from within, never leaving the church. And so while scandals need to be addressed, we need to be able to reform that, respond to that. It seems to me the more fundamental issue is for people who are in the church and leaving, we're not giving them an appropriate apologetic. We're not teaching them. We teach them sometimes what to believe, but we aren't giving them the grounds for why they should believe it. And statistically, that is the number one reason. So if you're going to kind of dive in any one area where you think you might be able to make a difference for people in the church, it's got to be the apologetics.
Yeah, so if you are going to evangelize me with a prayer request, and I had a couple of questions, and I sent back, I was like, you could direct your husband towards my husband's podcast. That might help, men listening to men talk about faith, that's good. Mm-hmm. And she's like, if I put it on in the background, he probably will listen. He won't listen to it on his own. So look, you're
smart. That's smart.
It is smart.
I like it. Yeah. There's the little things, underhanded evangelization, I call it. Yep.
My parents are coming to visit, and on the table next to their bed, I've placed a couple of books on my dad's side of the table.
Perfect. Seating.
Yeah. No, look, the chances of him actually opening the book are little, but I remember growing up, we had a lot of good books in the house, but then there were a few other ones that probably were gifted over the years. I'm pretty sure I remember seeing like the Kama Sutra in the house when I was a kid or something silly. But if you have people coming over to your house, you have kids in your house, what is in your house speaks for people coming over to your house, you have kids in your house, what is in your house speaks for what you believe. Mm-hmm. So having, not just saying filling up your house with books that you never read, but also making sure that you're reading these things, and you have to start with yourself. That's
right. And there's ways that you can invite conversations in an organic way. And again, this is something that our friends have told us. They come to our house. It is obviously Catholic, right? We have the bookshelves all over the place with all kinds of theology and philosophy books, and that often starts a lot of conversation. We have Mary over the mantle. We have our cross wall going up the stairs. And that's part of, I think, the beauty element. And Carrie Gress talks about this in her new book, Theology of Home, is, somebody walking into your home might be the only exposure they ever get.
Right. They might not go into a Catholic church.
Exactly.
But chances are you can get them to come over for dinner.
Yeah. And then, that's the step. So prudence, using practical wisdom to decide what is going to be the best approach here. What is going to be the best approach here? Is it beauty? Is it goodness? Is it apologetic arguments? And maybe just also, and I think people, can't forget about this, is just playing the long game, building relationships with people, being a great friend. Once you're a great friend with somebody, those types of conversations will naturally arise at some point. And then when you already have a relationship, then people are receptive to what you have to say because they know you, they like you, they trust you.
Yeah, one thing that I've heard a lot lately is that Catholics should be very joyful, mm-hmm. and the Catholics that make people stop and look and say, I want to be like that. What do they have that I don't have? Are the really joyful Catholics? Sure. So living out your life as a joyful Catholic can go a very long way.
That's right. The fruits of the Spirit, as we say.
That's right.
So.
Well, thank you for listening. And thank you to everyone who answered that question on Instagram. It was very awesome to see all the different reasons that brought you or kept you in the faith. Which you can, if you're not on Instagram or haven't found me yet, I'm at the Catholic Mama on there. Come say hello. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening so that you don't miss an episode. I've got a couple of fun guests coming up, including Carrie Gress and Jeannie Ewing, both wonderful Catholic writers. And, leave a nice review. Help spread this little ministry further along in the dark.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.